Poor thing. It's the same thing every year. Her whisper cut through the sound of crackling fire and Christmas carols. At least it can gather dust in the back of a drawer, right? The laugh that followed was sharp, a shard of glass in the warm air of my home. My son said nothing, and in that silence, I felt the floor give way. But what they didn't see was the calm that settled over me, a quiet, cold resolve that would change everything. What I did next silenced that laughter for good. So stay with me until the end, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's from your city, your work, or even the couch at home. My name is Carol Henderson, and I am 68 years old. My hands, stained with the earth of my Ashland, Oregon garden, tell the story of my life better than any words could. For nearly a decade, since my husband David passed, my world has been one of flowers. Not just the bright, living ones that fill my yard, but the dried, preserved ones I turn into art. It's a quiet craft, one of patience and care, and it has been my solace. My greatest pride, and now my deepest worry, is my son, Mark. He is the last living piece of the life I built with David. That Christmas Eve morning began like any other. The air was crisp with the promise of a cold Oregon night, and the scent of damp soil and dormant roses hung in the air. I had my cup of chamomile tea on the porch, watching the finches at the feeder, feeling a familiar mix of peace and anticipation. Peace in the routine, in the steady rhythm of my life. Anticipation for Mark's arrival. A feeling that, in recent years, had become tangled with a knot of anxiety. The quiet rituals that grounded me seemed to be the very things that created a chasm between my world and the one he now inhabited. The source of that chasm had a name: Tiffany, my son's wife, a corporate executive from Portland. She was a woman built of sharp angles, expensive fabrics, and an undisguised disdain for anything she deemed simple. My life, my home, my art. It was all simple. To her, it was old-fashioned, a relic of a time she had no interest in understanding. Our relationship was a fragile truce, maintained for Mark's sake, but the tension was always there, simmering just beneath the surface of polite smiles and strained conversation. Christmas Eve was the annual battlefield where this undeclared war played out. The gift exchange, a moment I once cherished as an expression of love, had become Tiffany's stage for displaying status. My handmade gifts were always met with a tight, forced smile that felt more like a wince. I knew this year would be no different, but I was unprepared for the sheer cruelty of it. I didn't know that a small, carved wooden box, filled with flowers from my garden, would become the weapon she would use to publicly dismantle my worth, right in the center of my own living room. I'd spent the entire day preparing. The house was filled with the warm, comforting smells of roasted turkey and cinnamon, a scent I'd always associated with family and joy. I'd set the dining table with my best china, the one David and I had received as a wedding gift, and decorated it with arrangements of dried hydrangeas and silver-dusted pine cones from the yard. Every detail was a labor of love, a piece of my heart laid bare for them to see. I wanted, foolishly perhaps, to create a space so full of warmth that it could melt even Tiffany's icy exterior. They arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tiffany stepped out of their sleek, dark car wearing a cashmere coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her perfume, a heavy, musky scent, entered the house before she did, immediately overpowering the smell of my cooking. Mark followed behind her, carrying a stack of perfectly wrapped presents. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, a man caught in a current, too exhausted to swim against it. He gave me a quick, tense hug that felt more like an apology than a greeting. The small talk before dinner was an exercise in futility. I'd ask Tiffany about her work, and she'd give me a one-sentence answer before turning her attention back to the glowing screen of her phone. She sat in the armchair by the window, a queen holding court in a kingdom she despised. I tried to catch Mark's eye, to find a flicker of the boy I raised, the one who used to tell me everything, but he just stared into the fireplace, his expression blank, already disconnected from the evening before it had even truly begun. Dinner was a quiet affair, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain. The food, which I had cooked with such care, seemed to turn to ash in my mouth. I watched Mark shovel food onto his fork, his eyes fixed on his plate. He used to rave about my roasted potatoes, telling me no restaurant could ever match them. Tonight, he ate them in silence. The atmosphere was so heavy, so thick with unspoken resentments, that I felt like I could barely breathe. I knew then, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that the evening was a house of cards, and the slightest breeze would bring it all crashing down. After we cleared the plates, we gathered in the living room. The fire crackled, casting a warm, deceptive glow on our faces. Tiffany claimed the large wingback chair, the one that was David's favorite, and crossed her legs, holding her wine glass like a scepter. She seemed to be surveying the room, judging every handmade ornament on the tree, every faded photograph on the mantel. The distance she put between us was more than physical. It was a declaration. She was in my home, but she would never be a part of it. The gift exchange started with the cousins. There was a flurry of wrapping paper and polite thank yous. The laughter felt thin, brittle, as if everyone was walking on eggshells, acutely aware of the tension emanating from Tiffany's corner of the room. She would offer a curt nod or a tight-lipped smile for each gift she received, her approval measured and calculated. She was not participating in a family tradition. She was evaluating a series of transactions, and so far, none had met her standards. Then, it was my turn. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached under the tree for the gift I'd made for her. It was a small box, carved from a piece of maple wood from my own backyard. I'd spent weeks sanding it, oiling it, carving a delicate floral pattern on the lid. Inside were sachets filled with my most fragrant lavender and a small, handmade frame holding a pressed Queen Anne's lace next to a photo of Mark as a little boy, his face bright with a gap-toothed grin. It was a piece of my history, a piece of my love. "Tiffany, this is for you," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I held it out to her. She took it with the tips of her fingers, as if she were afraid it might soil her. The room fell silent. Everyone watched as she lifted the lid. Her face was a blank canvas for a moment, and then the thinnest, most dismissive smile I had ever seen stretched across her lips. It didn't reach her eyes, which were cold and hard as river stones. She picked up one of the lavender sachets, held it briefly to her nose with an expression of mild disgust, and placed it back in the box. She glanced at the photo of my son for less than a second before closing the lid with a soft, final click. It was an act of complete and utter invalidation. She hadn't just rejected the gift. She had rejected the time, the effort, the love that went into it. She had rejected me. Then, she turned to her cousin, who was sitting on the sofa next to her. Her voice was a stage whisper, perfectly pitched to be heard by me and anyone else paying attention. "Poor thing. It's the same thing every year." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. I felt every eye shift towards me, a wave of pity and embarrassment. The warmth from the fireplace vanished, replaced by an icy chill that seeped into my bones. "At least it can gather dust in the back of a drawer, right?" The cousin let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of nervous agreement. And that sound, that single, mocking laugh, was the final blow. It wasn't just Tiffany's cruelty anymore. It was a shared joke. My love, my life's work, had been reduced to a punchline in my own home on Christmas Eve. The humiliation was absolute. I looked at Mark. I pleaded with my eyes for him to say something, to defend me, to defend the memory of the little boy in that photograph. But he just stared intently at the floor. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He heard every word. He felt the sting of it, and he chose silence. His silence was not neutrality. It was an alliance. In that moment, he sided with her, and his betrayal hurt more than her insult ever could. It was then that the years of quiet pain and swallowed pride inside me finally ignited. The pain was a physical presence in my chest, a cold, heavy weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. It wasn't about the box or the flowers. It was about my entire life being weighed, measured, and dismissed as worthless. Tiffany's words were a judgment not just on a gift, but on the way I lived, the way I loved. She was mocking the very essence of who I was, and my own son was letting her. In that moment, I thought of David. He would have been furious, not with loud shouts, but with a quiet, firm dignity that would have silenced the room instantly. He would have looked at Tiffany and, without raising his voice, made her feel the full weight of her cruelty. He would have stood by me. His absence felt like a raw, physical wound, a shield that had been taken away, leaving me exposed and alone in the face of this casual brutality. Tiffany, oblivious or perhaps enjoying her victory, placed the wooden box on the floor next to her chair with the same casual indifference she might show a piece of trash. She picked up her wine glass again, taking a long, slow sip, her eyes sweeping the room in a silent challenge. No one met her gaze. The power she held over my family was absolute. A currency of fear and intimidation that everyone it seemed, was willing to pay. My family, the people who had shared countless meals at my table, looked away. They suddenly found the patterns on the rug fascinating, or became deeply interested in a loose thread on their sweaters. Their averted eyes were a confession of their cowardice. They were all afraid of her, of the disruption she could cause, of the influence she wielded over Mark. And in their fear, they left me to stand alone in my humiliation. I looked at my son again, this stranger with a familiar face. The image of him as a child, chasing butterflies in the garden, flashed through my mind. That boy used to bring me handfuls of dandelions and proudly call them a golden treasure. Where had he gone? When had he traded that simple joy for this hollow, brittle life? When did he become a man who would watch his mother be torn down and do nothing? A strange thing happened then. The searing pain began to cool, to crystallize into something else. It was not anger, not yet. It was clarity, a profound, chilling clarity. I was a gardener. I understood that some plants are invasive, that they can choke the life out of everything around them if you let them. I had been letting this weed grow in my family for far too long, and it was time to pull it up by the roots. My eyes drifted to the remaining gifts under the Christmas tree. Tucked behind a few smaller boxes was a large one, impeccably wrapped in shimmering gold paper with a lush, cream-colored silk bow. It was also for Tiffany. It was the expensive handbag she had pointed out in a magazine weeks ago. It was my annual concession, my attempt to buy a moment of her approval, to prove that I could play her materialistic game. But as I looked from the expensive, empty gift to my son's defeated posture, I understood. This was never about gifts. It was never about handmade versus store-bought. It was about respect. It was about dignity. And those are things that have no price tag. A quiet resolve settled in my heart, firm and unshakable. I knew exactly what I had to do. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, steady purpose. I felt the weight of my 68 years, not as a burden, but as a foundation. Like the bedrock beneath my garden, it was solid, unyielding. Life had taught me patience, yes, but it had also taught me that there is a season for everything. A time for planting seeds of kindness, a time for nurturing growth, and a time for pruning away the parts that are diseased. The air in the room was thick with cowardice, but I was no longer breathing it. I was becoming the storm, and they were all about to learn what happens when a silent woman finally finds her voice. I felt utterly alone, but for the first time in years, I also felt completely in control. I didn't stand up in a fury. There were no tears, no trembling hands. The woman who rose from that armchair was someone even I didn't recognize. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if the floorboards beneath her feet were suddenly solid ground after years of walking on ice. The warmth from the fireplace felt distant, a sun from another solar system. All I could feel was the cold, clear purpose that had settled in my marrow. Every eye in the room followed me, a collection of tiny, silent spotlights tracking my slow journey across the rug. My steps were soundless on the thick wool. I passed Mark, and for a fleeting second, I caught the scent of his aftershave. the same one I'd given him for his 30th birthday. It was a scent of happier times, a ghost in the suffocating air. He didn't look at me. His gaze was still fixed on the floor, as if the answers to this entire miserable evening were woven into the carpet's fibers. I didn't feel anger towards him then, only a profound and bottomless pity. He was a boat without a rudder, and his wife was the storm. I knelt by the Christmas tree, the scent of pine and dry needles filling my lungs. The colorful lights blinked, casting cheerful, mocking patterns on the wall. My fingers, stained with a bit of soil from that morning's work, brushed past the smaller gifts until they found it. The large, ostentatious box wrapped in shimmering gold. The cream-colored silk bow was perfect, a stark contrast to the beautiful, imperfect, handmade box Tiffany had just discarded on the floor like a piece of refuse. Holding it, I felt its weight, not just in pounds, but in the currency of my own compromised dignity. With the box in my hands, I turned around. The room was a portrait of suspended animation. Tiffany's wine glass was halfway to her lips, frozen in place. Her cousin's nervous smile had evaporated, leaving behind a slack-jawed confusion. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law, and for the first time, I didn't try to find a flicker of warmth in her eyes. I simply met her cold, calculating gaze with my own newfound steel. A small, enigmatic smile touched my lips, one I had never practiced. "Tiffany, dear," I began, and my voice was a revelation. It was calm, measured, and carried a weight that silenced the crackling fire. "I think you're right. Gifts should be meaningful." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting everyone absorb the shift in power. "That's why, before I give you yours, I'm going to do you the favor of opening it myself." The silence that followed was no longer just tense. It was thick, heavy, and humming with the terrifying energy of a truth about to be born. I didn't wait for a response. I sat back down in my armchair, placing the large box on my lap. It felt like I was holding a weapon, though I had no intention of causing a wound. My goal was far more precise. I was performing surgery. I was about to cut out the cancer that had been poisoning my family for years. The room watched, transfixed, as I slipped my finger under the edge of the silk ribbon. There was a part of me, a small, frightened part, that screamed at me to stop, to put the box down and apologize for making a scene. That voice sounded like the old Carol, the one who would rather swallow pain than cause a ripple, the one who believed that peace at any cost was worth the price of her own self-respect. But as I looked at the little wooden box on the floor by Tiffany's feet, that voice died. I thought of the hours I'd spent carving it, the love I'd poured into every curve. That love had been treated like garbage, and in that moment, I knew that peace bought with humiliation is not peace at all. It is a slow, quiet surrender. My fingers worked at the knot of the ribbon. It came undone with a soft whisper, the silk sliding through my hands. I coiled it neatly and placed it on the small table beside me. Tiffany shifted in her chair, a flicker of something, annoyance, anxiety, crossing her face. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to protest this bizarre turn of events, but no words came out. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed to be at a loss. She was no longer in control of the narrative. I began to tear the wrapping paper. I did it slowly, not out of malice, but with a strange reverence. The sound was crisp and loud in the silent room. With each tear, I felt like I was shedding a layer of my own skin, peeling away the years of forced smiles, of biting my tongue, of making myself smaller to accommodate her ego. The gold paper came away in large sheets, revealing a sleek, black designer box underneath. It was the kind of box that screamed its own expense before you even opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft black cloth, was the handbag. It was a famous brand, a status symbol made of Italian leather, with a gold clasp that gleamed under the lamplight. It was the exact one she had pointed to in a magazine months ago, sighing about how it was an investment piece. I had saved for it, a quiet act of capitulation. I had bought it hoping it would buy me a single, genuine smile on Christmas Eve. I had bought it hoping it would make her see me as something other than a simple old woman with dirt under her nails. I lifted the bag from its box. The leather was cool and smooth to the touch. The smell was rich, chemical, a world away from the earthy scent of lavender and roses. I held it up for everyone to see. "This," I said, my voice still quiet, "is what I thought you wanted. I thought if I spoke your language, the language of price tags and brand names, then maybe you would hear me. Maybe you would understand that my love for my son, and by extension, for you, is real." Tiffany's eyes were wide now, fixed on the handbag. A flash of raw, covetous desire crossed her face before she masked it with a veneer of confusion. "Carol, I don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice tight. It was a command disguised as a question. She was trying to wrestle back control, to frame me as a confused, senile old woman making a scene. But the foundation of her power had already cracked. "Don't you, dear?" I asked gently. I placed the expensive bag on my lap and reached down to the floor. With the same care I had shown the designer purse, I picked up my handmade wooden box. I held one in each hand, a physical representation of two different worlds, two different value systems. "This," I said, holding up the wooden box, "took me 40 hours to make. It's carved from a maple tree that David and I planted on our first anniversary. The flowers inside grew in my garden, from seeds I saved myself. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I could feel the weight of every unspoken thought, every dawning realization. My family was finally seeing the disconnect, the chasm that had been papered over with polite fiction for so long. They were seeing the cruelty not as a single, isolated comment, but as the culmination of years of quiet condescension and dismissal. The air was electric with it. "This," I said, gesturing with the handbag, "cost me 3 months of my pension. I bought it at the mall in Portland. The saleswoman was very nice. It was made in a factory by people I will never meet. It has no story. Its only value is the one that you and people like you have assigned to it. It is an empty symbol, designed to make you feel superior to people who have things like this." And I held up my wooden box again, a little higher this time. Mark finally looked at me. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a dawning horror. He wasn't just seeing a handbag and a wooden box. He was seeing his entire life, his marriage, his choices, laid bare on the living room floor. He was seeing the woman he had allowed his mother to become in his presence, a target. And he was seeing the woman she had been all along, waiting underneath. The shame on his face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. A wave of doubt washed over me. Was I going too far? Was I destroying my relationship with my only son beyond repair? The thought was a sharp, physical pain, a twist in my gut. I loved him more than anything. But then I looked at Tiffany, and her expression was not one of remorse or understanding. It was one of pure, unadulterated fury. She was angry that her mask had been pulled off. She was furious that her game had been exposed. That look gave me all the strength I needed. This wasn't just for me. It was for Mark, too. It was an attempt to show him the truth of the cage he was living in. A gilded cage where authentic feeling was mocked and genuine connection was bartered for status. He needed to see it, to really see it, away from the influence of her carefully constructed world. This act was not an ending. It was a desperate, painful beginning. "So, you see, Tiffany," I continued, my voice finding its rhythm again, "you were right about one thing. A gift should not be something that just gathers dust in a drawer. It should mean something. And this handbag, it means nothing. Not to me. And giving it to you now would also mean nothing. It would be a reward for cruelty. It would be an admission that my world, my work, my love, is worth less than yours." I set the wooden box gently on the table beside me, as if it were a precious jewel. Then, I stood up again, holding the expensive handbag in one hand. I walked over to the fireplace, the eyes of the entire room following my every move. The heat from the flames washed over my face, a stark contrast to the icy resolve that filled me. I was no longer afraid. The years of quiet accommodation had been burned away. I turned to face them all, my back to the fire. "This bag represents every time I stayed silent when I should have spoken," I said, my voice clear and strong. "It represents every handmade gift that was met with a polite, empty smile. It represents every time I felt like a stranger in my own home. It is the price I paid to keep a peace that was never real to begin with. And I have decided that I am no longer willing to pay it." Tiffany's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. "You're being ridiculous, Carol," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "It's a purse. Give it to me. Don't ruin Christmas over a stupid box of potpourri." The insult, so raw and public, had no effect on me now. It was like a stone thrown into a deep well. I could hear the splash, but I could no longer feel the impact. It was never about the box, Tiffany, and it was never about the purse. I looked at my son, and my heart ached for the boy he once was and the man he had failed to become. It was about respect, the kind of respect that cannot be bought in a store or proven with a price tag. It is earned through kindness, through empathy, through the simple decency of not trying to break someone's spirit just to make yourself feel powerful. A profound sense of liberation washed over me. I felt lighter than I had in a decade. The decision was made, the path was clear. I was no longer a victim in this story. I was the author of the next chapter. The fear of losing my son was still there, a dull ache in the background, but it was overshadowed by the certainty that I was finally, after all these years, saving myself. I held the handbag a little tighter, the smooth leather a foreign object in my gardener's hands. "So, this bag will not be gathering dust in a drawer, and it will not be on your arm," I said, my gaze locking with Tiffany's. "It will be sold, and the money, every last cent, will be donated to the Ashland Community Garden Project. It will be used to buy seeds, soil, and tools, so that other people can have the joy of creating something real and beautiful with their own two hands." My words hung in the air, a final, unshakable verdict. The silence that followed my announcement was a living thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the crackling fire. Tiffany's face was a storm of disbelief and rage. Her perfectly manicured mask finally shattered. She stood up so abruptly that her wine glass wobbled on the end table, spilling a few drops of red like blood on the lace doily. Mark shot up beside her, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a panicked confusion. He looked from me to his wife, a man caught in a crossfire he had long refused to acknowledge. Without a single word, Tiffany grabbed her coat, her movements sharp and violent, and stormed out of the house. The front door slammed shut, and the sound echoed the final, definitive closing of a chapter in my life. Mark lingered for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as if he were a fish pulled from water. He couldn't look at me. His shame was a physical presence in the room, more suffocating than his wife's perfume had ever been. "Mom, he started, but the words wouldn't come. He just shook his head, a gesture of complete and utter defeat, and followed his wife out into the cold Oregon night. I heard their car start, the engine roaring to life before peeling out of my gravel driveway with a spray of stones against the fence. The house fell silent again, but this time, it was a different kind of silence. It was mine. That first night was the longest of my life. I sat in David's wingback chair, the fire slowly dying down to embers, and I replayed the scene over and over in my head. A part of me was terrified. I had detonated a bomb in the middle of my own family, and the fallout was unknown. The fear of losing Mark, of the permanent chasm I might have created, was a cold knot in my stomach. Had I gone too far? Was my dignity worth the price of my only son's affection? The old Carol, the one who craved peace above all else, whispered that I had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. But as the first hints of Christmas morning light filtered through the windows, another feeling began to surface. It was a quiet, steady warmth that started in my chest and spread through my limbs. It was the feeling of a spine straightening after being hunched for a decade. I looked at the little wooden box sitting on the table, a beacon in the dim light. It wasn't a symbol of my humiliation anymore. It was a testament to my value, to a love that couldn't be bought or sold. I had stood up for that love. I had stood up for myself. The fear was still there, but for the first time, it was smaller than my resolve. The next day, Christmas Day, I didn't wait for the phone to ring. The silence from Mark was a confirmation of where his loyalties lay, at least for now. Instead of wallowing, I took the first step. I went into my small studio, the scent of dried eucalyptus and lavender, a comforting embrace, and I turned on my old desktop computer. I typed, "Sell luxury handbag Portland," into the search bar. The results were a foreign language of consignment shops, authentication services, and resale values. It was a world I knew nothing about, but I felt a surprising lack of intimidation. I was a gardener. I knew that learning to cultivate something new required patience and research. I spent hours comparing websites, reading reviews, and understanding the process. I chose a reputable luxury consignment store in downtown Portland, one that had glowing testimonials. The process was straightforward. Fill out a form, upload photos, ship the item, and wait for their offer. Each click of the mouse felt like a deliberate act of reclaiming my own narrative. I took pictures of the handbag from every angle, the clinical process stripping it of any lingering emotional power. It was no longer a symbol of my capitulation. It was simply an asset, a tool for a new purpose. After submitting the form online, I found a sturdy box and began to package the purse. I wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, not out of reverence for the object, but out of a practical need to ensure it arrived in perfect condition to fetch the highest price. As I taped the box shut, the sound of the tape pulling from the roll was sharp and final. I was sealing away the version of myself who thought a 3-month pension payment could buy respect. I was mailing away the illusion that I could ever fit into Tiffany's world by playing by her rules. With the box ready to be mailed, I felt a surge of proactive energy. I walked out into my garden. The winter air was crisp and clean. I looked at the dormant rose bushes, their thorny canes reaching for the pale sun, and I saw a reflection of my own resilience. They looked bare and vulnerable, but I knew that deep within, life was waiting, ready to bloom again when the time was right. I grabbed my trowel and began to weed a patch of earth, my hands sinking into the cold, damp soil. The physical work was grounding, a reminder of what was real and enduring. This was my world, and it was worthy. The phone finally rang that afternoon. It was Mark. His voice was strained, tight with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "Mom, what was that? You completely humiliated Tiffany. You ruined Christmas." His words were an accusation, the ones I had dreaded hearing. The old me would have immediately apologized, taken the blame, and tried to smooth things over. A wave of that old instinct washed over me, the familiar, sickening urge to make myself small to keep the peace. I felt my throat tighten, the apology already forming on my lips. But then I looked out the window at my garden, at the steadfast, quiet dignity of the winter landscape. "I didn't ruin Christmas, Mark," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "Tiffany's cruelty and your silence did that long before I ever opened that box. I simply stopped pretending it wasn't happening." The line went quiet. I could hear his breathing, the sound of a man confronting a truth he had spent years avoiding. The silence stretched on, thick with everything that had been left unsaid between us for a decade. "She's my wife, Mom," he finally said, his voice cracking slightly. It wasn't a defense, it was a plea. He was trapped, and he wanted me to understand the impossibility of his position. My heart ached for him, for the good man I knew was buried under years of compromise and fear. "I know she is, honey," I replied gently, "but I am your mother, and I will not be treated like dirt in my own home, not by her and not by anyone." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The simple, unadorned truth was powerful enough. After we hung up, the internal battle raged. Had I been too harsh? Was I forcing him to choose? The fear of being utterly alone in my old age was a terrifying specter. I wandered through my quiet house, the ghosts of 1,000 happier Christmases taunting me from every corner. I saw a photo of David and me on the mantel, taken in this very living room 30 years ago. He was beaming, his arm wrapped securely around my shoulders, I remembered his unwavering belief in me, his quiet fury anytime someone tried to diminish me. He would have been proud. That thought was an anchor in the storm of my doubt. The next day, I drove to the post office and mailed the package to Portland. The act of letting it go, of sliding it across the counter to the postal worker, felt momentous. It was a physical release. On the drive home, I made another stop. I went to the small office of the Ashland Community Garden Project. It was a modest place, filled with mismatched furniture and the earthy smell of potting soil. A kind-faced woman named Sarah listened intently as I told her my plan. I didn't share the whole ugly story, only that I was selling an item and wanted to donate the proceeds. Her eyes lit up as she described what the money could do. They needed to build new raised beds for elderly residents, buy organic seeds for the children's program, and repair their aging irrigation system. Seeing her genuine passion, her dedication to nurturing life in the community, affirmed my decision in a way nothing else could have. This was where the bag's empty value would be transformed into something real. I left her office feeling not vengeful, but purposeful. The act was no longer about punishing Tiffany. It was about empowering something beautiful. A few days later, I received a call from my sister, who had been at the dinner. "Carol, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "I heard what you did. It was brave, but are you sure it was wise? Tiffany can be vindictive, and you don't want to lose Mark." Her words were well-intentioned, the voice of caution, of familial pressure to maintain the status quo. It was the same logic I had used on myself for years. It was the logic of fear. "I'm sure," I said, with a certainty that surprised even myself. Sometimes, the wisest thing you can do is stop being so accommodating. The offer from the consignment shop came a week later via email. It was a substantial amount, enough to make a real difference for the community garden. As I clicked accept, I felt no regret, only a clean, quiet satisfaction. The transaction was complete. That same day, I received a short, chilling text message from Tiffany's number. It read, "You've made your point. You've also made your choice. I hope you and your flowers are very happy together." It was a declaration of war, a final severing of ties. It was meant to hurt, to isolate me. But instead, it felt like a cage door swinging open. Mark didn't call for 2 weeks. The silence was heavy and deliberate, a punishment for my defiance. In that time, I poured myself into my art. I created a new series of pressed flower arrangements, working with a focus and clarity I hadn't felt in years. My hands, usually so steady, had trembled after the confrontation, but now they moved with renewed confidence. My work became my therapy, each delicate petal and stem a piece of my own story, a story of finding strength in what others deemed fragile. My little studio became a sanctuary, a place where my worth was never in question. The loneliness was real, especially in the evenings. The house felt too big, too quiet. Old habits of self-doubt would creep in during the silent hours. I would find myself reaching for the phone to call Mark, to apologize, to beg him to bridge the gap. But I would stop myself, my hand hovering over the screen. I would walk to the window and look out at the moonlit garden instead. I had to learn to be my own anchor now. I had to trust that the roots I was putting down were strong enough to hold me, even if I was standing alone. The check from the consignment store arrived in the mail. I held it in my hand, a simple piece of paper that represented so much more. It was the end of a painful chapter and the seed money for a new one. I didn't deposit it into my own account. I took it straight to the bank and had a cashier's check made out to the Ashland Community Garden Project. Holding the official check, with its crisp font and authoritative feel, was one of the most empowering moments of my life. This was real. This was happening. I drove to the community garden and found Sarah, the coordinator, turning compost. Her face broke into a radiant smile when she saw me. I handed her the envelope. She opened it, and her eyes widened as she saw the amount. She was speechless for a moment, and then her eyes filled with tears. "Carol," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "you have no idea what this means. This isn't just a donation. It's a future. It's a whole season of hope for so many people." She gave me a hug. a heartfelt embrace that smelled of soil and sunshine. In that moment, standing in the middle of that communal patch of earth, I felt a connection that was more real and nourishing than any of the strained family gatherings I had endured for years. This was family, too, a family of people who cared for the earth and for each other. I had taken something born of ugliness and contempt and transformed it into something that would grow, that would feed people, that would bring joy. The cycle was complete. A few days later, Mark called. His tone was completely different. There was no anger, only a deep, weary sadness. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "I'm sorry. I should have said something. I should have defended you." He told me that the week since Christmas had been illuminating. Without me as the buffer, Tiffany's sharp-edged nature had been turned fully on him. He was seeing the coldness, the transactional nature of her affection, in a way he never had before. He was beginning to understand the cage he was in. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice broke my heart. I just wanted to say, "You were right." It wasn't a victory. There was no triumph in hearing my son's pain, but it was a beginning. It was the first honest conversation we had had in years. I didn't offer solutions or say, "I told you so." I just listened. I let him know that his mother was still here, and that the love I had for him was as real and enduring as the garden outside my window. That evening, I sat on my porch, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same brilliant hues of orange and purple as it had on Christmas Eve. The setting was identical, the ritual unchanged, but I was not the same woman. The anxious knot of anticipation I used to feel before Mark's visits was gone. It was replaced by a quiet stillness, a sense of peace that came not from the absence of conflict, but from the strength to face it. I looked down at my hands, at the faint lines of soil etched around my nails. Tiffany had seen them as the hands of a poor thing, a simple old woman. But I knew the truth. These were the hands of a creator. They were the hands of a woman who knew how to cultivate beauty, how to nurture life, and how to prune away the parts that were dead and diseased to allow for new growth. I had finally done that in my own life. I had not lost a son. I had cleared the way for him, and for myself, to find our way back to the sun. The phone call with Mark didn't feel like a victory. There was no triumphant surge, no satisfaction in hearing him say I was right. It was more like the quiet, somber moment after a storm has passed, when you step outside to survey the damage and see the world washed clean. The air was different. The silence on the line after he hung up wasn't the heavy, punishing silence of before. It was a space for healing, a patch of tilled earth waiting for something new to be planted. I knew then that the foundation of our relationship, which had been built on the shifting sands of my compliance, had crumbled. Now, we had the chance to build something new, something on bedrock. A few weeks later, in the pale sunlight of a February morning, I saw the first tangible results of that Christmas Eve. I walked down to the Ashland Community Garden, and there they were, 4 new, beautiful raised garden beds, built with cedar that smelled sharp and new in the cool air. A group of children from the local elementary school were there on a field trip, their bright jackets a splash of color against the brown earth. They were planting pea shoots, their small hands carefully placing seeds in the soil that my handbag had bought. I watched them, their faces alight with the simple, profound joy of creation, and I felt a warmth that no designer accessory could ever provide. Sarah, the garden coordinator, spotted me and waved me over. She gathered the small group of volunteers and parents together. "I want everyone to meet Carol," she said, her voice full of genuine warmth as she put an arm around my shoulders. "The woman who made these new beds possible." There was a small, scattered round of applause. People I recognized from the grocery store, neighbors I'd only ever waved to, came up to thank me. They didn't see a poor thing. They saw a benefactor, a fellow gardener, a woman who had invested in their community. The respect in their eyes was a quiet, steady flame, warming me from the inside out. The contrast with that Christmas Eve was so stark it almost took my breath away. In my own living room, surrounded by family, I had been made to feel worthless, my life's work reduced to a punchline. Here, among relative strangers, I felt seen and valued for the very essence of who I was. I had been mocked for making things with my hands, and now, the symbol of that mockery had been transformed into a tool that would allow dozens of other hands, young and old, to do the same. It was a perfect poetic justice that brought no gloating, only a deep, abiding sense of peace. The world had been put right again. I didn't feel pride in that moment, not in the boastful sense. What I felt was a profound sense of rightness, of a cycle completed. The money, which had been a symbol of my pain, of my son's silence, of Tiffany's cruelty, had been alchemized. It was no longer tainted. It had been washed clean in the rich, dark soil of the garden and was now sprouting into something that would nourish people, body and soul. I had taken the ugliest part of my life and used it as fertilizer. And from it, something beautiful was beginning to grow. Mark and I started talking more regularly, our conversations tentative and fragile at first. He told me he had started seeing a therapist, trying to unravel the years of choices that had led him to that silent, paralyzed moment on the living room floor. He was learning to set boundaries, to find his own voice, not just with Tiffany, but with himself. This was the greatest conquest of all, an intangible victory that meant more than any garden bed. I hadn't just stood up for myself. I had inadvertently held up a mirror to my son, and he was finally, bravely, looking at his own reflection. Our old relationship had been a dance of avoidance. I would carefully step around any topic that might upset Tiffany, and he would gratefully accept the false peace it created. Now, that dance was over. We were learning a new one, slower and more deliberate, based on the difficult steps of honesty. He told me about his fights with Tiffany, about the coldness that had settled into their home. I didn't offer advice. I just listened. I was no longer a mother trying to fix her son's life, but a woman holding a safe space for the man he was trying to become. My sister called me a month after Christmas. Her tone was completely different from her previous cautious warnings. "Carol," she said, a note of awe in her voice. "I haven't stopped thinking about that night. You know, for years, we all just let her be her. We were all so afraid of rocking the boat. But you didn't just rock it, you capsized it. And honestly, it needed to happen." Her words were a balm, a confirmation that my act of defiance had sent ripples out farther than I had imagined. It had given others the permission to question their own silence. My art began to change, too. Before, my studio was my refuge, a place to hide from the world. Now, it was my platform. The arrangements I created felt bolder, more confident. The colors were brighter, the compositions more daring. A local gallery owner who had seen my work at a farmer's market approached me about a small solo exhibition. It was a dream I had long ago packed away, like a box of old keepsakes. Now, here it was, being offered to me. It was another tangible sign that when I had stopped shrinking myself to fit into someone else's world, my own world had begun to expand in ways I never thought possible. I realized that the artistic success I was now experiencing wasn't a coincidence. It was a direct result of my transformation. For years, I had been creating from a place of quiet defense, my art a shield against the world's harsh edges. But after that Christmas, I began creating from a place of strength. My hands were no longer just seeking solace. They were making statements. My art was no longer a whisper. It had found its voice, right alongside me. The very craft that had been dismissed as a quaint hobby was now being recognized as true art, because I had finally started treating it, and myself, with that level of respect. In early spring, when the first crocuses were pushing through the soil, Mark came to visit. He came alone. It was the first time in years he had walked through my front door without Tiffany. He didn't offer an excuse for her absence, and I didn't ask. The air between us was clear. He looked me in the eye when he spoke. He helped me turn the soil in my own garden, his hands, usually accustomed to a keyboard, sinking into the earth. We worked in a comfortable silence for a while, the simple, shared task, a bridge across the chasm that had separated us. As we were washing our hands at the kitchen sink, he told me, "Tiffany and I are separating." He said, his voice quiet but steady, "It wasn't just about Christmas, Mom. That was just the crack that showed how broken everything already was." I felt a pang of sorrow for his pain, for the death of the future he had envisioned, but I felt no triumph. I simply dried my hands, turned to him, and pulled him into a hug. I held my son as he quietly wept, not for the end of his marriage, but for the years he had lost being someone he wasn't. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking of Tiffany. The sharp edges of my anger had long since smoothed away, leaving behind a strange sense of pity. I saw her not as a monster, but as a deeply insecure woman, so terrified of being seen as simple or common that she had to build a fortress of expensive things around herself. She couldn't appreciate my gift because she had never learned to appreciate anything that didn't come with a price tag. I realized then that I was free of her. She no longer had the power to hurt me because I finally understood her, and understanding is the antidote to hate. That spring, I began teaching a small workshop on botanical art at the community garden. I showed a small group of women how to press flowers, how to see the beauty in a fading bloom, how to create something lasting from things that are ephemeral. Sharing my passion, the very thing I had been mocked for, brought me a joy so profound it felt like sunlight spreading through my veins. The simple craft had become a source of connection, a way to build a new community, one branch and one blossom at a time. The woman I was before Christmas would never have had the confidence to stand in front of a class and teach. She was an artist who worked in private, a woman who stayed in the background. She was a mother who lived on the periphery of her son's life. The woman I was now stood at the center of her own. I was no longer an accessory to someone else's story. I was the author of my own. And I was discovering that it was a far more interesting and beautiful tale than I had ever imagined. My life was no longer about quiet endurance, it was about joyful creation. One evening, I took the small wooden box from the mantelpiece. I ran my fingers over the carved flowers on the lid before opening it. The scent of lavender, faded but still present, rose to meet me. I thought of the woman who had poured her hopes into this box. The woman who believed that a pure enough expression of love could melt a cold heart. I felt a wave of compassion for her quiet pain and her desperate need for acceptance. I honored her journey, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that she was gone. I used to think that strength was about how much you could endure in silence. I believed that absorbing pain without complaint was a virtue, that keeping the peace was the ultimate goal. That night, holding that box, I understood the truth. True strength isn't about silent endurance. It's about having the courage to honor your own worth, to speak your truth, even if it shatters a false peace to pieces. It's about realizing that your dignity is not a negotiation. It is the bedrock on which a life of meaning is built. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from a woman who had been in my workshop. "Dear Carol," it began, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about the story you shared about your Christmas. You probably don't know this, but your quiet courage gave me the strength to have a difficult conversation with my own family. For the first time, I didn't swallow my feelings to make everyone else comfortable. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to find your voice." Reading her words, I realized the most important thing I had cultivated this year wasn't in my garden. My story was no longer just my own. It had become a small seed, carried on the wind, landing in the gardens of other women's lives. It was the story of anyone who has ever been made to feel small, anyone who has had their love dismissed, anyone who has been told that who they are is not enough. It was a simple, universal tale about the quiet, revolutionary act of claiming your own space in the world, no matter how old you are, and no matter how long you've been silent. The profound lesson of it all settled in my heart, as simple and true as a seed sprouting toward the sun. You can spend a lifetime hoping others will see your value, but that recognition will never come until you claim it for yourself. The respect I now received from my son, my community, and even my own reflection in the mirror was not something they had given me. It was something I had finally, after 68 years, demanded. It grew from the inside out. I stand in my garden now, in the cool, misty light of dawn. The air is filled with the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. This is the same garden, the same house, the same woman, but everything is different. The quiet anxiety that used to be my constant companion has been replaced by a deep, calm stillness. I am no longer waiting for a car to pull into the driveway to validate my existence. My validation comes from the soil under my fingernails and the steadfast beat of my own heart. So many of us spend our lives carefully crafting our own little boxes. We fill them with our time, our care, our truest selves. We offer them up with hopeful hearts, and sometimes they are dismissed. Sometimes the person we offer them to tells us, with their words or their silence, that our gift is not enough, that we are not enough. It is the deepest cut of all, the one that can make you want to stop making boxes altogether. But this is what I have learned. Do not let their dismissal define the value of your gift. The worth was never in their acceptance. It was in the making. It was in the love you poured into every corner, every carved detail, every pressed flower. That is a sacred truth that no one can ever take away from you. Your love, your effort, your very essence. They have an intrinsic value that exists completely independent of anyone else's ability to see it. A garden teaches you many things, but the most important lesson is about pruning. To allow for new, healthy growth, you must have the courage to cut away the parts that are dead or diseased. It can be a painful, frightening act. You look at the bare branches and worry that nothing will ever grow there again. But you do it with faith, trusting that you are not destroying the plant, but saving it. You are making space for the sun to get in. My name is Carol Henderson. I am 68 years old, and my hands are stained with the earth. I am no longer waiting for an invitation to a table where I am not welcome. I am building my own, right here in my garden, with my own 2 hands. It is a table made of cedar and sunlight, and there is a place set for my son, for my friends, and for anyone who understands that the most beautiful things in this world are not bought, but grown.